resurrection? Will you say a prayer during the Lord's Supper? Might you take a songbook and look carefully over the words of a song that is talking about the death of Jesus? What will you do when we today observe the Lord's Supper? What special efforts will you make as you partake and you think about how you are doing this matter? Will you teach your children what this is all about? In Deuteronomy, the 6th chapter, God said in verse 20, the day is going to come when your children are going to ask you, what is the meaning? What are the meaning of these statutes? What are the meanings of these ordinances? And you shall tell them. And the next several verses, God goes into extreme detail of all the things that had happened, how they were being treated in Egypt, and what God did for them, and the mighty works that we saw, and how He has led us through the wilderness to this place, to this day. You tell your children. Make sure they understand. I've always appreciated Bob Waldron, who talked about when they set up the stones at Jericho. After they crossed the Jordan River, they were told to set up stones. And he said the same thing. One day your child's going to ask you, what do these stones mean? And you shall tell them. I remember Bob saying one time, what a tragedy. If a man and his son are walking along, headed towards somewhere near the close of the day, the sun is soon to set, and the son sees those stones and he says, Father, what are these stones here? What do these stones mean? The father, feeling pushed for time, says, we set those up here at the Jordan River when we came out of Egypt, and that's kind of help us remember that. And let's get on now. Let's get on. How terrible. Here was a grand opportunity to help your son to know what these things mean. And so we need to take the time to help our children to understand and to help them to maintain as best we can the reverence that should be maintained in the Lord's Supper. And yes, if necessary, do what it takes to quieten them. Take them out if necessary. Do whatever we can to maintain the proper reverence as we partake. But I want to hit something else here that I feel so strongly about, and I'll try to simmer down a little bit here to try to make this get across. And that is that it refers to how we are living. When he says, don't you partake of this in an unworthy manner, he's talking about how we're living. Notice in verse 25, he says, in the same manner he also took the cup after supper. And he said, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. This do as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. Did you hear the part about the new covenant? This cup is the new covenant. I don't know if we emphasize that enough. We talk about the blood. But he says, no, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. And what he's trying to say there is, look, every single one of you who have become Christians, you have entered into a covenant with God. You have made an agreement with Him, and it's a grand agreement. God says, I will be your God. And we say to God, and we will be your people. And so he says, when you partake of the Lord's Supper, you need to think about how you're living. Are you living true to your covenant with God? Notice in verse 27 again. Therefore, whoever eats this bread or drinks this cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of the body and the blood of the Lord. Does that sound good to you? That sounds like to me he's going to feel the same way about me as the original people who crucified Jesus, if I don't partake of this in a worthy manner. But he goes on to say in verse 28, but let a man examine himself. See, it's not just about thinking about Jesus during the Lord's Supper, but it's thinking about what He did for you and how that you are now in a covenant with Him, and you examine yourself. You ask yourself, are you living as a covenant person should? Are you living as God would want you to each and every day? He continues to say, for he who eats and drinks in an unworthy manner eats and drinks judgment to himself, not discerning the Lord's body. You're not thinking about the gravity of this. It's the Lord's body. Verse 30, he says, for this reason many are weak and sick among you, and many sleep. Here's what I say about that. He's saying, because of the way you have done this thing, a lot of you are already weak. Some of you have gone past weak, you're sick. And some of you are past sick, you're slap dead. Now here's the point I want to make. That's what happens when you do it wrong. Weakness, sickness, death. That's when you do it wrong. Right. But what in the world would happen if we did it right? It will take us to levels that will put dedication in us in the most extreme kind of way. So let me ask you again, as you think about it. Verse 31 says, if we would judge ourselves, we would not be judged. And that's the idea of this being a judgment seat. Listen to me carefully. If we would judge ourselves, we would not be judged. It seems that he is saying, when you come before this table, you put yourself under a judgment. And you look at yourself good and hard and strong. And basically what God is saying is that if you don't pass your own judgment, you can rest assured you won't pass mine. So you either judge yourself right here and get it right, or you can face me later. I mean, that's really what he's saying. If we would judge ourselves, we would not be judged. And look at what he says in the next verse. But when we are judged, we are chastened by the Lord, that we may not be condemned with the world. So let me ask you, do you understand that it is even more dangerous to desecrate this memorial? Did you do anything special today? Did you think about your covenant and how you're living daily? When I was growing up, one of the things that I would see quite often when I was growing up is that sometimes when the Lord's Supper was served, people would just let it pass right on by them. You'd kind of see them when it was offered to them, they'd just go, they'd just shake their head no. And then I noticed that it would go right on past them. And oftentimes I think that was because they were aware of something they had done during the week, and they knew that that was wrong, and they just felt they couldn't protect the Lord's Supper. And I appreciated that sentiment. I appreciated that kind of thought. But what I really would rather say to people is, first of all, this: you don't have to be perfect to partake of the Lord's Supper. Right. I don't know of anybody here who could say, I didn't mess up one single time this past week. Who could say that? Who could say that? We're not talking about having to be perfect. But what we are talking about is you better be struggling. You better be doing your dogged best to live according to your covenant with God. And when you mess up, it breaks your heart. And then you come on the Lord's Day, maybe having already prayed that morning before you got here and said, Lord, I thank you so much for this past week. I know I wasn't everything I needed to be, but I thank you so much that when I came to you, you forgave me. And when I come before the table today, help me once again to rededicate myself totally and fully to you as I enter into this new week. God's not trying to discourage you away from the table. He's trying to encourage you to understand what this can do for you. And really what he's saying is that if you're not living according to your covenant, you better not touch that table. And I do mean that. Go to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, keep in mind, he's moving toward chapter 11 when he talks about the Lord's Supper. In chapter 10, he's talking about idolatry. And his point is that we all know that idols are nothing. But what's behind the idols is very real. And here's what he says is behind the idols. What's behind the idols are demons. The devil and his angels are the ones who push idolatry. And you may say, well, an idol's nothing. Well, that might be so. But demons are real. And when you go to that idol's temple and you eat from that table, you're having fellowship with demons.
That's right.
And so he basically says in these two verses, you got to choose your table. And so he says in verse 20, I say that the things that the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. And I do not want you to have fellowship with demons. Listen to this. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. He's saying don't mix your tables. If you're going to go out there, if I'm going to go out there and drink and eat from the world's table, leave this table alone. Because it's dangerous to desecrate this table. Look at verse 22. Do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? He says in the last part of verse 21, you cannot partake of the Lord's table and the table of demons. Or do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than He? Every time I've seen where God had a rival, it didn't take long to see how He felt about that. He told those people at Mount Sinai, you take your calf and you ground it to powder and you put it in that water and you drink it. You drink your calf. And God said on that occasion that my name is jealous. I won't tolerate rivals. And He got right angry about it. We're not stronger than He. And so we need to be serious about this table. Now let me just slow down here and make sure you understand. Do you have to be perfect during the week? No. Do you have to be really giving it your all to live for God? Absolutely. And if that's not you, get right. If you have to, just go downstairs between now and the next service and you talk to God a little bit and then come back up here and get this table right. Again, God's not encouraging you to leave it alone. He's saying, why don't you get right and then come to it? But it's dangerous to desecrate that table. Turn to Hebrews chapter 10 now. Got to move along. Hebrews chapter 10. Picking up in verse 26. In Hebrews 10 and verse 26, it says, if we sin willfully, this is a person who's not trying to keep his covenant. If we sin willfully after we have received the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a certain fearful expectation of judgment, and fiery indignation which will devour the adversaries. Anyone who has rejected Moses' law dies without mercy on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. Here's the point. Even under the law of Moses, if you rejected Moses' law, and you were not striving to live according to it, God said, put him to death, stone him, on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. But this is not the old covenant. This is the new covenant. So he says in verse 29, of how much worse punishment do you suppose will he be thought worthy who has trampled the Son of God underfoot and counted the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified a common thing and insulted the Spirit of grace? You want to talk about a verse that makes me shake? It's that one. Amen. How much worse punishment will you be thought worthy when you trample the Son of God under your feet? See, when you're not striving to live right, and I'm not striving to live right, it's like walking all over Jesus. Just say stomping on Jesus. And he says you're counting the blood as though it's just a common thing. Oh, it's just fruit of the vine. That's all it is. And you insult the Spirit of grace because the Spirit is trying to make you like Jesus and you won't have any of it. And it's insulting to the Spirit. See, that's the idea. That's strong, isn't it? Right. And so this is the gravity of our memorial. In the time that we have left, let me just quickly ask you some questions here. Did you do anything special today? The Jews had a preparation day before the Passover. And here's what it says. The quality of an occasion and the success is often determined by the amount of preparation that goes into it. Would you agree with that? Yes. You're going to get out of it what you put into it, right? In the Scripture, the day before the onset of Shabbat, or the Sabbath, is called the preparation day. To be able to keep the Sabbath properly, adequate preparation is necessary, which means planning ahead. As part of the spiritual preparation, a cleansing ritual and a bath. It's followed by a prayer and a reading of the Word. That has become a tradition in order to draw close to Jehovah God for the commencement of the day. They take a bath and pray. All of this in preparation for the Sabbath. That's what the Jews would do because they understood how important that day was. Let me ask you this. Did you do anything special yesterday because she knew today was coming. Connie Adams talked about when he was growing up, he said, Dad always made us gather in the living room on Saturday night, and we call it shoe shine night. He said he gathered all those boys together and we had to shine our shoes because tomorrow was the Lord's Day. I've often wondered what kind of impressions are being made on a child as you shine your shoes. And you think about why you're doing that, why you're choosing to do that. Did you avoid a late nighter last night? Or did we roll tide and war eagle and go wildcats all the way into the wee hours of the morning? Did you start thinking about today, last night? Did you do anything special when you got up this morning? Let me ask you this. What was your very first thought when you woke up this morning? What was your first thought? Now, I know that I have an age on all of you because I presented this lesson, so it's kind of keen on my mind. But on my phone, there's an alarm that goes off. There's an alarm that goes off first thing on Sunday morning. There's an alarm that goes off. And what that alarm simply says is that He is risen. It is the Lord's day. Rise and worship. And so that's what I do. That's what I do on the first day of the week. I normally go in the first order of business and sit at my kitchen table and I'll read a passage of Scripture relating to the Lord's Supper. I normally take that same Scripture and read it again during the Lord's Supper. So did you do anything special this morning when you got up? I know some churches that require those who wait on the Lord's table to wear a coat and tie. What do you think about that? Somebody may say, the Lord doesn't have a dress code. I agree with that. But let me ask you this. Do you think that's kind of nice? Is that a nice, reverent kind of thing that they're choosing to do? I think most of us would say so. That we definitely think that that's the case. I know the Lord is looking at our hearts, but it may be that somebody says, well, I just want to do something special today. I think I'll dress special. I did for the wedding that I went to last night. I did for a funeral that I went to last week. I did for Easter when everybody normally gets a new little outfit. Not that Easter has any special significance to God. I did it for another special ceremony that I attended. I think I will. I think I will for this too. I'll tell you what I think about that. I think that's nice. And I've often thought that, sometimes just the doing of things like that can give you a little bit of a mind shift. There's certain gestures that we do sometimes that cause us to think about why we're doing it. For example, I don't teach any certain prayer posture. But every time I do this, it says something to me. Amen. There's not many people in America that are going to do this. But when you do that, it says, you are God. I'm just me. You are worthy. I am not. See, it communicates a lot, doesn't it? I've tried them all, kneeling, being flat on your face, lifting your hands towards heaven. But they all suggest something. My Uncle Thomas and my Aunt Neil, they used to get down on their knees right in front of the pew and they pray with their head in the pew and kneeling. I used to see that when I was growing up. I asked my Uncle Thomas not long ago, I said, Uncle Thomas, I remember you and Aunt Neil, y'all used to do that. Y'all used to get down like that and do like that. I said, why did y'all stop doing that? He said, we couldn't get up. And fortunately, I still can. Now, when I did that at Eastside a couple of weeks ago, Susan said she heard my knees pop when I got up. And so I know that's when that kind of happened. But anyway, the only dress code I know that God requires is that we be reverent. And however you choose to express that, that's great. God has no code that I know of. In fact, the only time I can remember God talking a lot about clothes in the Bible was He was getting on to the dressed up people. In James chapter 2, He's getting on to the ones who had fine clothing, and they shamed those who didn't. But I do remember other things too. I remember Joseph wanted to shave and wash his clothes before he went in to see Pharaoh. I remember David, after his son died, it says he rose, he washed his face, He changed his clothes, I think I remember. And he went to God's house and worshiped. Again, God has no code, but he does have this code.